this class. I'm excited to be teaching at Pardes again. And what we're going to be doing each week is looking at the Parsha through the lens of Midrash. And this might be something that I hope is gratefully received as we're looking at the Parshiot that we're in at the moment. I was overhearing my wife learning with my sister-in-law, Chevrusa, on this week's Parsha, and it's difficult stuff. You've got all this purity and impurity of childbirth at the beginning, and then you have we start to talk about leprosy, and the book of Leviticus, with all of its purity and impurity, its animal sacrifice and the like, can be something of a culture shock. And yet, on the other hand, something I noticed my sister-in-law and wife saying was, wow, how pertinent to be talking about a disease that sends people into quarantine, right? And I want to think a little bit about that with you today. So a large part of our double reading, the reading is Tazria Mitzora, is about the diagnosis, the treatment, and the rehabilitation of people with this disease called Sarat. And please feel free, by the way, I'm just going to talk at you, but please feel free at any time to ask a question if you have one. Okay, so this disease called Sarat, and you know, traditional translations of the Bible, following actually the Septuagint, they translate Sarat as leprosy. But there's good reasons for thinking that the disease described by the Bible doesn't fit the profile of leprosy. First of all, leprosy is contagious. And despite the fact that the Mitzorah, the person with Sarat, was sent into quarantine, we'll see that this has little to do with fears of contagion. It's some sort of quarantine to do with ritual impurity. In fact, the priest who will go to inspect the Mitzorah doesn't seem to have any concern that he's going to catch the disease from close proximity. He doesn't go in with full PPE in the way that if you've been for a corona test, you'll see the people that test you look a bit like spacemen. That's not what the Kohen does when he inspects a person who's already been diagnosed with Mitzorah. In fact, the description that the Bible gives us, it paints a picture of a disease that causes skin discoloration, and hairs within those patches of skin can turn white. And these patches can spread rapidly within just a couple of weeks. And there was perhaps the founder of the field, Yehuda Katz-Nelson, fascinating individual, who wrote about biblical medicine. And he studied the kind of profile of Sarat, of this biblical malady. And with his medical knowledge, came to the conclusion that vitiligo did I say, my mother-in-law will know if I pronounced that right because she's interested in dermatology, but I hope I said it right.
It's vitiligo.
Vitiligo, thank you, Safta. Vitiligo is apparently the skin disease that that comes closest to a description of Sarat, and indeed the similarities are even more pronounced once one filters in some of the rabbinic descriptions of the symptoms that you can find in Masechet Negaim of the Mishnah, Mishnaic descriptions. Because actually Yehuda Katz-Nelson's study was on Talmudic medicine rather than just biblical medicine. He says, once you read in all of the stuff that the rabbis say about Sarat, it becomes even more apparent that vitiligo the disease being dealt with. For instance, the Midrash, and we can all look at this Midrash together. I'll share my screen with you. 1 second. Let me share screen. Do I have the ability to share screen? Yes, I do. Thank goodness for Safaria that has all of the texts that we need at a on call whenever you need it. So we have in the Midrash Vayikra Rabbah a description of kind of the underlying physiological causes, so to speak, of Sarat. It says here, if you can see, I can give you a spotlight. It talks about, here's my spotlight there. It talks about what happens when the water level and the blood level inside you come out of kilter. So it says, Umayim tiken b'midah, Adam hayam shukal chetzio mayim v'chetzio dam. Right, so we have water and we have blood in us. B'sha'a shehu zocheh lo amayim, ravin al Adam, v'lo Adam ravin al amayim. When he's innocent, but in this case, I think it means clear of Sarat. You have there's more blood than there is water. Uvizman shechoter, when he's a sinner, pamim shamayim ravin al adam v'nase adripikos. Sometimes, if he's a sinner, there's more water than there is blood, and he gets this condition called adrifikos. And sometimes the blood overpowers the water and makes him a matzora. So Sarat, let me stop sharing now. Second. So Sarat is, according to this opinion, merely a physiological condition. Although it does talk about sinning and not sinning, the suggestion is that you have within you a delicate balance between blood and water. Adripicus, so that first disease we had, is apparently dropsy. So the thought was, when the water dominates over the blood, you can come down with dropsy. When the blood dominates over the water, you can come down with Sarat. Now, definitely what we saw is that Midrash was suggesting that these imbalances occur in response to sinning. So the causes are spiritual, but the ailment itself, according to this Midrash, seems like a purely physiological malady. It's some sort of bodily imbalance. And in actual fact, this is quite consistent with what we know of ancient Greek medicine, for example. Ancient Greek medicine tended to view all illnesses in terms of internal imbalances. You had these humors of different colors, red humor, black humor, green humor. You have water, you have blood. And when there are imbalances between them, they manifest in various illnesses. And Babylonian medicine, by contrast to Greek medicine, thought of illnesses as a response to attack from outside. And that's why you see a great interest in Babylonian medicine in demons, right? So when you get attacked by a demon, that's what causes epilepsy or other sorts of conditions. And interestingly, contemporary medicine takes something from both of those schools of thought. Even though we no longer believe in demons and we no longer talk in terms of a balancing of the humors, there are diseases which are the result of internal causes, internal imbalances, whether they be genetic or neurological or chemical. And there are conditions that come, like the coronavirus, from outside, whether it's in forms of virus or forms of bacteria. But despite what the Midrash tells us, right, the Torah actually gives us good reason to think that the ailment itself, Sarat, was more than just a fluid imbalance, that the ailment itself was supernatural. right? So based on a traditional reading of Exodus 21:19, so the verse Exodus 21:19 tells us that we're supposed to heal people that get injured, okay? And from there, we have a halakhic obligation. We learn a halakhic obligation that you're always supposed to seek the best medical advice available. And that's a halakhic obligation. The halakhic authorities bring this down. Here's a nice summary of that. Let me share my screen again with you. Here we go. Back to Sefaria. This is now the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is a codex of Jewish law, a concise codex of Jewish law. HaTorah natna reshut l'rofeh sheyirapeh. The Torah gives permission to doctors that they should heal, and it comes from this verse in the book of Exodus, like I said, v'rapah yirapeh, you should surely heal the person. Well, if we're commanded to heal a person, that means that doctors must have permission to do their job. And therefore, a sick person is not entitled, is not allowed to rely upon a miracle. You don't say, oh, I won't take this vaccination because I trust in God. No, that would be to rely on a miracle. No, you have to follow the ways of the world, so to speak, the ways of the natural world, and go to a doctor to get healed. You find many of the great tzaddikim would go to doctors to get healed, and none of them said, oh, I'm going to rely on a nes, on a miracle. Furthermore, what about somebody who says, I don't go to the doctor, I am a tzaddik, and therefore I don't go to the doctor, I rely just upon God, I'm a holy person. Shtayim ra'ot hinehu oseh. He's done two evil things. Ha'achat, the first thing that he's done wrong. Da'asur lismoch al hanes. He has broken Jewish law, which says that it's forbidden to rely upon miracles in times of danger. And therefore, in the time of his illness, his sins are going to be remembered before God, right? That's going to be counterproductive. You don't want God to be looking down at you when you're ill and seeing a sinner, but a person who doesn't go to a doctor is sinning. Va'od, the have yuhara v'geut. It's also tremendous arrogance. Shesamech al tzidkato, to say, oh, I'm so righteous, I don't need to go to a doctor. Okay. So why am I bringing this halakha? It's important, and I think timely halakha, because we have right now a medical emergency in the world, and there are some people saying, look, I don't need to take the precautions because limud Torah will help me, or my righteousness will help me. Well, that's forbidden because you're relying on a miracle, and what's more, it's arrogant and unethical, let alone in cases of contagious diseases, dangerous to other people. But be that as it may, who do you go to if you have sarat? Do you go to a doctor? No, you go to a priest. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the great German kind of founder of a type of modern orthodoxy, pointed out. And in fact, I can make this. I should have finished reading the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch to you because it gets even more apparent. He says, it's a good idea to go to the most expert, right? So how do you choose your doctors? Do you choose your doctors according to how holy they are, how righteous they are, how religious they are, how Jewish they are. No, the one thing you want to know is how good are they at healing people, right? What are their statistics like, right? How likely are you to recover if you go to Dr. A rather than Dr. B? That's the only halachic consideration. And yet if you have Sarat, the Bible says your treatment is only through the priest, right? So a rabbinic Jew who wants to look at the Bible as being consistent with the Talmud and with Jewish law, want to say, well, it can't be, therefore, that Sarat is a completely physiological and natural disease. Because if it was a completely natural and physiological disease, the halakha would tell us that we have to go to a doctor. But instead, the halakha tells us to go to a priest. The priest also determines, first of all, whether or not you have Sarat, and also when the quarantine ends. So given the halachic duty to consult a medical expert when stricken with a medical condition, this amounts to evidence against my dear Yehuda Katz-Nelson, whose Encyclopedia of Talmudic Medicine I find very interesting. But the indication is that this isn't vitiligo or leprosy or any malady that a doctor could recognize at all. It's a purely spiritual malady that somehow has some sort of physical manifestation. And notwithstanding that one Midrash that we looked at in Vayikra Rabbah that talks about dropsy and an imbalance internally, I think that that is a fringe opinion among the rabbis, and that what Rabbi Hirsch is telling us, that this is clearly not a medical malady and clearly a spiritual malady with merely physical manifestations, is the more mainstream opinion, for good reason. Moreover, the biblical ailment of Sarat, I'm going to call it Sarat all the way through rather than leprosy for this reason. It's described as infecting clothes and buildings as well as people. And as far as I'm aware, and again, my mother-in-law can correct me if I'm wrong, but clothes and buildings are generally beyond the traditional remit of the medical sciences, right? So this isn't purely a medical phenomenon. This is a spiritual phenomenon that has some sort of medical manifestation. Okay. So at this point, I suggest we should take a step back and think about where Sarat appears in the arc of the book of Sefer Vayikra. And this is why I'm hopeful that that looking at the book of Vayikra through the Midrashim, people think of Midrash sometimes as, an excursion on rabbinical fancy and speculation and flights of rabbinical fancy and speculation. And it can be, and we'll see some quite fun Midrashim along the way. But you shouldn't underestimate the extent to which Midrash can be used as a tool for unpacking what's really there in the book of in the books of the Torah and the books of the Bible, of the Tanakh at large. So let's just think about where Sarat appears in the book of Leviticus. Okay, so the book begins with some laws of animal sacrifice. Okay, and animal sacrifice is something we're going to come back to time and again in the book of Leviticus, and I hope at some point we'll have the opportunity in this course to look at what the Midrashim have to say about animal sacrifice, because animal sacrifice itself is a strange and counterintuitive ritual. But putting that to one side, the book opens with some commandments about animal sacrifice, a description of the inauguration of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, with its tragic death of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, which we saw last time. But then, from chapter 11 all the way through to chapter 17, we deal with concepts of ritual purity and impurity. And there's a progression in the biblical presentation of purity and impurity. It starts with animals. So last week's Parsha, we read the list of kosher animals and unkosher animals, but this wasn't couched in terms of kosher and not kosher. It was couched in terms of tamei and tahor. The kosher animals are tahor, they're pure, and the unkosher animals are tamei, they're impure. And what does that mean? Well, it means this. There's no way to render a dead pig pure. It doesn't matter how it died. If it died of a heart attack or it died through shechita, doesn't matter. It's impure. And if you touch it, you'll become impure too. But a cow, if it dies of natural causes, it will be just as impure as the pig, because dead animals are sources of impurity. But there's a kind of magical thing about cows that pigs don't have, which is that if you slaughter them in a very specific way, then they won't be impure, even though they're dead, okay? But what we see is the really toxic thing when it comes to purity and impurity. What is the main contaminator? What is the main toxic ingredient? It's death, right? It's dead bodies that make things pure and impure, dead bodies, sorry, that make things pure. And we start with this code of animal purity and animal impurity because there are some exceptions, which is why we're allowed to eat meat and why we're allowed to sacrifice animals, because there are some exceptions. But generally, dead bodies equals impurity. And then we move on from cases of animal impurity to cases of impurity that come from the human body. Now, some of these impurities that come from the human body are quite vulgar discharges, but there's a central concern, and I don't mean to be vulgar, but there's a central concern in the Bible's description of bodily impurity in a living human being with the reproductive organs. Okay, so every time a man ejaculates, he is rendered impure. And every time that a woman menstruates, she is rendered impure. And this, I think, is not, it's not far from the thing that we've started with, which is that death is the main contaminator. Because basically, a human man holds a number of seeds within him. And each one of those seeds has life force, because each one of those seeds could, in the right circumstances, contribute towards the creation of a human baby. And when a human man ejaculates, he loses from his own body that life source, or those cells that contain that life source. So there is, so to speak, in the act or in the event of ejaculation, a diminution, if that's the right word, of life within the body of the man. So too, when a woman menstruates, each time she loses an egg. And in fact, you know, we know from couples that are trying to have babies that that period of a period can be a quite devastating time, because there's a notion of opportunity lost. There's a notion of, oh, this could have been a life, but it wasn't. And likewise, a miscarriage renders a woman impure. What we see at the beginning of this week's Parsha, before we get on to leprosy, is that if a woman gives birth, whenever a woman gives birth, she becomes impure. Oh, hold on, how can that be? There's more life in the world, not less life. Yes, that's true, but there's less life in her body, and her body is what becomes impure because it has lost life. And in fact, it becomes more impure if she, so to speak, she's impure for longer if she gives birth to a girl than if she gives birth to a boy. Now, I imagine this is because girls are symbols of fertility. more than boys. And if you want a physiological explanation that wouldn't have been available to the rabbis, the girl is born already with eggs in her ovaries, right? So there is more life force contained in that fetus that leaves the mother's body and therefore renders her impure for longer. And of course, a dead human body is also a source of impurity. So it's then that it's in this context of bodily impurity that we first hear about Sarat, this disease, this malady. And we should also look at what happens after Sarat. Okay, we have from chapters 18 to 27, they deal with the notion of holiness. Okay, that we're supposed to be a holy people. And this is where Leviticus moves from its ritual, its fascination with strange rituals and ritual concepts like Tum and Tahara and alien rituals like animal sacrifice to stuff that's much easier, I think, for modern readers to understand when we talk about Kedusha, holiness, because a lot of that includes codes of ethics, right? Part of what it means to be holy is just to be good, ethically good. It also has to do with the festivals and holy times, holiness in space, holiness in time, and holiness in deed. But it's from that point onwards that Leviticus, I think, becomes an easier read. The book of Vayikra becomes an easier read. But the idea is, if you look at the book as a whole, there's supposed to be a progression from purity to Kedusha, from purity to holiness. That's the kind of general arc of the book of Leviticus. We're supposed to be punctilious in our ritual observances, animal sacrifices, codes of ritual purity, including the dietary requirements, and that divides the animal kingdom into pure species and impure species. And yet, these observances, they're not an end in themselves, it seems. They're supposed to make room for the possibility of Kedusha, of holiness. And next week, on Monday, we're going to speak about that notion of holiness. But this week's reading, it falls right in the middle of the purity code. So if you think of Leviticus containing these two codes, the purity code and the holiness code, we're right in the middle of the purity code. And as I said, the code starts out with animals. Dead animals are a source of impurity, and it moves on to humans, and it moves on to the reproductive organs and to reproduction in general. But let me be very, very clear here. It's quite obvious. It should be quite obvious to anybody that being ritually impure is no ethical stain upon a person. In fact, there are going to be times where you have to become impure. One of the greatest mitzvahs in Judaism is the Met mitzvah, is to bury the person who doesn't have next of kin. Now, that is impossible to do without becoming impure. So the greatest mitzvah is going to make you impure. Likewise, it's a mitzvah to procreate. And the mitzvah of procreation renders both the man and the woman impure. So impurity certainly shouldn't be equated with any sort of moral black mark. It simply can't be, right? Because these great mitzvahs are mitzvahs which make us impure. And yet, it seems as if the Sefer Vayikra is telling us that if you don't have the notions of purity and impurity in your vocabulary, you're not going to be able to rise to this level called Kedusha. So it's not that you need to be pure in order to be holy, but it's something like you need to know about purity and impurity, and you need to be cognizant of these concepts, and you need to abide by the laws of the purity code, which sometimes will mean you have to become impure. That's fine, but you need to know these laws and abide by these laws. They are going to be a prerequisite to a certain type of ethical life that's even higher than an ethical life. It's a holy life. But it's not that you need to be pure in order to be holy. Now, what is the biblical disease of Sarat doing here? Now we've kind of had a sketch of the arc of the book of Vayikra. What is the biblical disease of Sarat doing here in the middle of the purity code? In fact, it inserts itself quite abruptly between the discussion of childbirth impurity and later discussions of bodily impurity that have to do with menstruation and semen, right? So you'd have thought perhaps that Vayikra would talk about all the reproduction stuff in one go, including childbirth, but also menstruation and ejaculation, and would then move on to Sarat if it had to talk about Sarat at all. But in fact, Sarat's right in the middle. It interrupts between the purity that comes to a woman through childbirth and the impurity that comes to men and women through various events that happen to their reproductive systems and organs. Right? What's it doing here? So there's one explanation that perhaps isn't too far-fetched, comes from a Midrash. Let me share the screen with you. This is Vayikra Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, one of the oldest collections of narrative Midrashim. The Midrashim collect rabbinic commentary on verses, and this is an early one collecting rabbinic commentaries from the time of the Tanaim, from the time of the Mishnah. It says, Makativ lamala min ha'inyan. Well, what does the Torah tell us before it tells us about purity? What's it juxtaposed with? Well, I'll tell you. Isha tazria v'yalda zacha. It talks about a woman conceiving and giving birth. Makativ batre, and what's written after it? Adam kiyev or basara. Something to do with leprosy coming on the skin. What is the connection between leprosy? I shouldn't call it leprosy, I should call it Sarat. What's the connection between Sarat and a woman giving birth? Amar Rabbi Tanchum Rabbi Chanilai. Rabbi Tanchum, in the name of Rabbi Chilai, says, Mashal lechamora shera'ata v'nichveit v'yatza b'na kavui. Mi garam levlad sheyetze kavui shenichveit imo, kach mi garam levlad sheyem etzora imo shelo shimra yemei nidata. The basic idea is that the one thing is a cause of the other. The idea of the mashal is stop sharing. The idea of the mashal is, if you see that something's bad for your child, right? You'll tell them about the consequences, and you'll hope they won't do the naughty thing. I'll tell you an experience I had with my wife when we were in our first year of marriage. We went to South Africa, and we were involved briefly for one day with a project that had to do with sex education in the informal kind of shanty towns around Cape Town in this case. And one of the tactics used by this group to promote safe sex in the middle of the HIV pandemic was to show photographs of quite horrible deformities that could come to a person through sexually transmitted diseases. It was something of a scare tactic. And you'd show them, and they'd all get together. They look at them, oh, look at that, and it was quite funny, right? And all these men would get together, oh, whatever, and you'd joke with them about it, but you imagine they might think twice before having unprotected sex after looking at such a picture. Anyway, that was the hope. And says this Midrash, Sarat is a punishment from God for people who misuse their sexuality. So Sarat is a spiritual malady. It doesn't come it's not a medical thing, but it comes to you if you are licentious or you sin in the field of sexual relations, how do we know this? Well, God talks about the purity and impurity that comes from reproduction, and straight away tells us all of these horrible stories about deformities that can happen to your body. Well, God is warning you. What will happen if you don't, God is like Gabby and I were in the township of outside Cape Town, showing people the horrible consequences that physically that might happen to you if you don't behave yourself. And another Midrash in a similar vein tries to derive from verses in the book of Isaiah that Sarat is a punishment more generally for sexual impropriety, right? And I think these explanations, they would account for the placement of the biblical discussion of Sarat in the middle of its discussion of reproductive purity and impurity. But I think perhaps the best explanation is just more prosaic. Right, the discussion of bodily impurity starts with whole bodies. In fact, the first human body impurity we hear of is a dead human being. So that's the whole corpse, okay? It moves on to a discussion of whole people giving birth to whole babies, right? Accordingly, before it moves on to the emission of bodily fluids, which are actually entirely removed from the body, it makes sense for the Torah to describe the impurity of Sarat, which primarily breaks out upon a person's skin in local areas, though it can affect the hair, clothes, and houses too. Sarat is less removed from the body than a bodily emission, and that might explain what would otherwise look like an interruption. But the idea of linking the disease to sin, it actually makes a lot of sense once you accept that this is a completely spiritual malady. We're talking in the book of Vayikra about the creation of a holy people, like I said. And when all goes to plan, that holiness is supposed to run so deeply that a person out of kilter with his or her own values will break out in Sarat. I know some philosophers who'll break out in hives as soon as they read some bad philosophy, right? So deep does their value of good philosophy run in them that as soon as they hear any bad philosophy, they break out in hives, right? So the idea is, Sefer Vayikra wants to create a people so holy that when we act in ways that are out of kilter, as I said, with our values, there will be a physical manifestation of that. And it's for this reason, according to the rabbis, that Sarat doesn't exist anymore, because it's a sign of our spiritual malaise. And indeed, let me share the screen with you again. The Chafetz Chaim, the author of the Mishnah Berurah, was called the Chafetz Chaim because he wrote a book, first of all, on the laws of Lashon Hara, of bad speech, the rules of speech, Shmirat HaLashon, guarding your tongue. And I'll just read the English that Safaria has nicely left us here. In all this time when the temple stood, as opposed to our situation today, in our many sins, when we have neither temple nor sacrifices nor cleansing kohanim, so that if the Holy One, blessed be he, brought plague spots on his body, he would remain in his uncleanliness forever, it being impossible for him to cleanse himself from it. Therefore, the uncleanliness of the plague spot that came through this sin would remain in his soul alone and would not project from his soul onwards. And this is the intent of the Midrash. This is a Midrash brought in Yalkut, Parsha Metzora, in the name of Rav Yanai. He who guards his mouth and his tongue guards his soul from troubles, tsarot. And there's a play on words there. The word troubles, tsarot, sounds like tsarat, this disease, from the tsarat of his soul. The plague spot of tsarat is affixed in the soul. So the idea is that, it's actually a bad thing that we don't get this today. It shows that we're not as, so to say, spiritually elevated as our forefathers, who who had a temple standing, but who were so in touch with their values that when they slipped, they would break out in Sarat. Now, another Midrash teaches that there are 7 causes of Sarat. Let me share this with you too. Well, I'll just read you the English that I have here. This is Midrash Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, chapter 16, Midrash 1. It says, God hates 6 things, 7 are an abomination to him. That is a verse from Proverbs, from Mishlei. God hates 6 things, 7 are an abomination to him. Anyone's taking notes, that's Mishlei 6:16. 6 things God hates, 7 are an abomination to him. Now in our Midrash, Vayikra Rabbah 16:1, Rabbi Meir argues that this verse is referring to 13 terrible things, since 6 and 7 make 13. The rabbis, by contrast, argue that there are only 7 things under discussion, but the 7th is so bad that it's equivalent to the other 6 put together, okay? So are we talking about 13 things, or are we talking about 7 things? Trust the rabbis to have that debate. But the verse in Proverbs carries on, and it actually seems to list 7 things. So 6 things the Lord hates, 7 are an abomination to him. 1, a haughty bearing. 2, a lying tongue. 3, hands that shed innocent blood. 4, a mind that hatches evil plots. 5, feet that are quick to run to evil. 6, a false witness testifying lies. And 7, one who incites brothers to quarrel. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, in our Midrash, Vayikra Rabbah 16:1, all 7 of these vices are the causes of Sarat. And then the Midrash actually tries to bring a proof for every one of our putative causes. So the scab on the head received by the haughty daughters of Israel in the prophecy of Isaiah 3:16-17, that serves as a proof that a haughty bearing can cause Sarat. The episode of Miriam received Sarat in punishment for talking behind Moses's back in the book of Numbers, chapter 12. That serves as a proof that a lying tongue, or more generally the sin of gossip, can cause Sarat. The shedding of innocent blood is a cause of Sarat, as we learn from David's general Yoav, who sheds innocent blood and is stricken by Sarat. In 2 places you can look this up, Malachim Aleph, Kings 1, chapter 2, and also Shmuel Bet, chapter 3. 4, the affliction of King Uzziah in 2 Kings 15:5 is supposed to serve as proof that hatching evil plots can result in Sarat, because he hatched evil plots and lo and behold, he got Sarat. 5, the affliction of Elisha's servant Gehazi serves as proof that feet that run to do evil can cause a person to come down with Sarat. And they learn this from 2 Kings 5:27. Admittedly, the Midrash doesn't actually bring an independent proof that bearing false testimony is a cause of Sarat, but this might just be subsumed under the episode of Miriam, taken as a warning about the misuse of speech in general. One second, Gabby. The Sarat that blighted Pharaoh in the book of Genesis, Paro, that's right, gets Sarat when he takes Sarah hostage, is the Midrash's proof that people that cause animosity to spread between brothers and sisters who incite quarrels received Sarat. So, to cut a long story short, Sarat is a miraculous spiritual malady. It has any number of potential spiritual causes: sexual impropriety of one form or another, or the 7 sins listed in the book of Proverbs, or the 10 sins associated in a different Midrash. There's another Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah 17:3 in the name of a different rabbi that says, Al Asarat Dvarim Negaim Ba'im, There are 10 reasons why plagues come. They are idolatry, incest, murder, the desecration of the name, blasphemy, robbing the public, taking what is not one's own, arrogance, the evil tongue, and the evil eye. But there's no doubt that in the Jewish popular imagination, one cause is much more prominently associated with Sarat than any other. If I was to ask you, what's the cause of Sarat, what would you have said?
Lashon hara.
Lashon hara. Lashon hara, speaking bad. That seems to have been what kind of all the, we've seen, I think all in all, 17 or 18 potential causes in among the rabbis, but Lashon hara seems to be the one that won. Okay, that's the one that kind of captured the public imagination. And I think also, so to speak, the Midrashic imagination, you see it more often. I think perhaps the prominence of this boils down to the centrality of the story of Miriam. Right? The Torah explicitly commands us to remember that episode. In Deuteronomy 24:9, it says, remember what God did to Miriam. Some actually have the custom of saying every day, they read out the 6 places in the Torah where it says, remember, and this is one of them. So some people read this to themselves every day, reminding themselves of what God did to Miriam. The biblical treatment and rehabilitation of the Metzora, actually the way that the Bible deals with the Metzora, have led some people to think specifically about the misuse of speech. It's as if the rituals of Sarat are specifically designed to comment upon the gossiper. And this is what I wanted to share with you most. If there was one source that I most wanted to share with you, it comes up in the Talmud. It's a Midrash, I would call it a Midrash still, because it's a rabbinic commentary on verses, but it appears in the Talmud. Often when this sort of thing appears in the Talmud, you call it a Gadata. You can call it a Midrash as well. It appears in Masechet Arachin 16b. I'm just going to read you the English. It was asked of Rabbi Hanina, and some say that it was asked of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. What is different about a Metzorah that the Torah states he shall dwell alone outside of the camp shall be his dwelling? The question is, why does the Metzorah, why is he put in quarantine? Now, it's all very well if you think this is a medical malady, you put them in quarantine to stop contagion. But there's no notion that this disease is contagious, at least in the biblical descriptions of it. So why is this person put in quarantine and no other? That's the question the Gemara asks. And remember, Miriam was put into quarantine, right? She had to leave the camp. And this is the answer that was offered. He caused separation between husband and wife and between one person and another. He created rifts with his gossiping. Therefore, the Torah says, he shall dwell alone. The idea is the person who got Sarat did so, received Sarat because of his negative speech. And what did negative speech create? It creates social disharmony. It severs human relationships. And therefore it's an appropriate punishment to be sat alone, to have his own relationships with other people cut asunder, just as he cut asunder other people's relationships, so to speak, with his misuse of speech. And then Rabbi Yehuda ben Levi says in the same Talmudic source, in the same discussion, what's different about a Metzorah that the Torah states that he has to bring 2 birds for his purification, right? Normally, birds are bought by poor people. But even if you're a very, very rich Metzorah, you bring birds in the sacrifices at the end of your quarantine before you're rehabilitated into society at large. Why birds? And this is what Rabbi Yehuda ben Levi says. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, he acted with an act of chatter. Therefore, the Torah says that he is to bring an offering of birds who chirp and chatter, right? So as the Metzorah rejoins society, birds are offered up to remind the one who brings them that he can do better than the idle chatter of what today we would call the Twitterverse. Now, we only have a few more minutes left, but I just wanted to raise the story, so to speak, of Rav Yisrael Salanta, one of the founders of the Musa movement. Between 1846 and 1860, there was a cholera pandemic. It was the third of the 19th century's cholera pandemics. It killed 23,000 people in the United Kingdom alone. And in 14 years, it killed over 1 million people in Russia. And one of the leaders of global Jewry at that time was Rav Yisrael Lipkin, better known as Yisrael Salanta. And with the pandemic, when the pandemic was at its peak in Lithuania, many Jews started to point fingers and to blame the pandemic on certain sins and certain sinners. Rabbi Salanta patiently pointed out that Sarat required for its treatment a period of isolation. The reason for this, he explained, was because the ailment was a consequence of evil speech. The sin isn't specifically that language was used to tell untruths. The sin, as Rabbi Salanta explained it, was that the gossiper is only interested in uncovering the sins of other people, never himself. The period of isolation, the spiritual quarantine of the Metzora, is designed to convey the following message. If you're such an expert at finding fault in others, leave the camp, sit alone with yourself, and use that expertise to discover your own weaknesses and sins. So there's a kind of irony here. After listing all sorts of sins that could cause Sarat, the one that stuck in the popular imagination was the sin of misused speech. Perhaps that's because it's actually not for us to say why a certain ailment comes to a certain person at a certain time. Right? There could be all sorts of reasons. The only person we should ever point a finger at is ourselves. So in a sense, there's a kind of irony, as we'll see a lot in the Midrash. The Midrash kind of pokes fun at itself from time to time. The Midrash seems obsessed with this idea of saying, oh, you get Sarat for this reason, you get Sarat for that reason, you get Sarat for this reason, you get Sarat for that reason. Then it says, oh, I'll tell you why you really get it. You get it for saying why people got Sarat. You get Sarat for pointing out where people's faults are. You shouldn't be doing that, even if it's true. But the Midrash has been doing that for ages. But that's part of the charm and the humor of Midrash. It's often quite meta, and one requires a certain sensitivity perhaps to see that. But I hope that we have seen it together. And I just want to say, just to finish off, that if the lesson is that we should be much more probing of ourselves than probing of others, if that's the reason why the Metzora goes into quarantine to begin with, if that's the lesson, I don't want you to think that it means that we should rise to levels of unhealthy self-chastisement and self-loathing, right? In actual fact, the Metzora leaves the period of isolation with a very strange little ceremony. You can read it this week. There's a drop of blood on the thumb. There's a drop of blood on the big toe, and it's the strangest thing. And there's one bird that gets blood on it and flies away, and one bird. And there's only one ceremony that's remotely similar to it. Do you know what ceremony that is? It's the inauguration of the high priest.
Right. That's right.
So it's actually quite an honor, right? A sinner, and we're all sinners, who goes through a period of self-reflection is welcomed back into the community as an honorary high priest, a religious luminary, an inspiration. There is actually something great, first of all, about having a body that is sensitive enough to break out in Sarat when its actions fall out of kilter with its values. And second of all, such a person who goes into quarantine and uses that bidud, that isolation, as an opportunity to rectify that kind of conflict within his own moral universe and comes back to the society, is not somebody who should be shunned. On the contrary, they become, through that whole process, something of a moral hero, like a secular high priest. We can offer obviously no theological account as to why this plague of corona is blighting the world. And in fact, if we were to try and blame it on various people, we would be worthy of Sarat ourselves. But as we sit in the safety of shutdowns and bidud, and I hope we'll have to do that less and less often now that we have the vaccine and green passports and whatever, but perhaps the Midrash is telling us that we can take this opportunity to look at ourselves in the mirror without the distractions of social proximity. We can come to understand better our strengths and weaknesses and resolve to leave our quarantine when the time is right as better versions of ourselves, as secular high priests. So that is how I've used the Midrash this week to try and make a certain amount of sense of what would otherwise be a very strange Parsha. We've situated its discussion of Sarat within the arc of the book of Vayikra itself, an arc which moves from this very strange notion of ritual purity and impurity and all these bodily things to the very supreme and uplifting notions of holiness that we're going to get to eventually. And when you probe the Midrashic universe, I think you can make more sense of this progression. Why? Because a people who are sensitive to the values of life and death, because that's what purity and impurity are about, that's what we've been talking about. A people who are sensitive to the values of life and death are a people who are more likely to be able to be holy, and people whose values run so deep that when they come out of kilter with oneself, when a person acts out of kilter with one's values, to break out even in a physical looking malady, it's that type of society which will be capable ultimately of holiness. This doesn't equal holiness. There's nothing holy about kashrut observance. It's a prerequisite for holiness, and that's what we'll talk about.